Hello and welcome to HEXATalk, the industry refresher powered by Hexanica. Today we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Jana Burke, who is the Senior Vice President and Senior Regulatory Counsel at the Independent Community Bankers Association. She was also a counsel at FDIC, Associate General Counsel and Vice President of the Consumer Bankers Association, and she has worked for a divisional counsel at the state of New Mexico Regulation and Licensing Department. So very avid background. And when it comes to today's topic, where we are going to a little bit touch upon ESG as a topic, she's also going to speak about her experience at ICBA and perhaps share her overall thoughts on these topics. So today's conversation, we will cover a few other elements and we are going to speak and ask few questions specific to Jana. But before we start, Jana, welcome. Would you like to share anything more about yourself or ICBA, or please share some introductory thoughts? Jana, to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me today and for the warm welcome. I'm thrilled to participate in this HEXATalk and to share some of my perspectives on ESG, as well as my experience at ICBA Live, which was the largest annual gathering of community bankers, an opportunity for community bankers to network, sharpen their skills, and celebrate community banking. We held the conference last week, and happily we were able to do so in person for the first time since the onset of the pandemic. ESG was a topic that was discussed at ICBA Live and is increasingly becoming a focus of interest, both within the financial services industry as well as just the industry at large.
Excellent. And before we proceed, just wanted to share that the views that Jana or I represent are views of not officially of the firms, but our own individual views. And let's dig into the first question. So you mentioned about ESG, you mentioned about the interest of financial services and ICBA Live. In your perspective, there were few sessions that you were part of as well. Could you please give some insights or what kind of discussions you have had with especially community bankers? What are they thinking about, so on and so forth?
Sure. ICBA Lives showcased several learning labs for banks to hear perspectives on ESG, with most of the discussion focused on just understanding what is ESG, what are its drivers, and exploring both the risks and opportunities in considering or developing an ESG strategy.
So great. And you know what I've also experienced, Jana, is when I speak to community bankers, sometimes they don't even realize that they're already doing ESG, whether it's environmental aspect of it or social aspect of it or governance out of it. Although there is a new term, but there are bits and pieces that they're already doing it. And that has been my experience. Has that been your experience as well as, would you like to throw some light on the message that overall came out of the event in terms of 22, 23, what are bankers thinking of, what they should be doing, and anything that are futuristic?
Absolutely. ESG is really a new frontier. And so as with any new endeavor, there's a lot of uncertainty around ESG, a lot of competing narratives right now to sort out. But as you mentioned, many banks, when they really start to kind of peel back the onion and explore ESG, may find that they're sort of naturally compliant with many of the principles that are contemplated by an ESG framework. So before we kind of delve into the details here, I think it'd be helpful for our audience to just kind of start with a basic understanding of what is ESG? What are we talking about here today? ESG is a set of metrics and standards for an organization's operations, and it explores the organization's environmental and social impacts, as well as how the organization responds to these impacts and governs itself. So breaking it down a little bit further, the E stands for environmental. This category contemplates factors like climate-related risks, energy management and efficiency efforts, as well as impact on carbon emissions. S stands for social, and this category can refer to an institution's efforts to promote diversity and inclusion, non-discrimination, as well as local community involvement. The G stands for governance. And this category contemplates factors like board composition and committee structure, executive compensation, risk management and anti-corruption practices, as well as cybersecurity measures. So this is really designed to be a framework for disclosure of information about a corporation's practices aligned within each of these three categories.
Thank you. That was great introductory, I would say, aspects about ESG, just, what is E, S, and G. Thank you for that, Jenna. That was awesome. And I know we have a panel that is coming up, which is titled as Navigating the Rapidly Evolving ESG Landscape and the Underlying Risk and Compliance. And you mentioned about disclosures. So there seems to be the governmental agencies such as ACC or FDIC. I've read a lot of articles and etc. And I'm pretty sure that in the panel we'll go in details about what those possible disclosures are. Are there any already compliances of any part of ESG that the banks are doing, so on and so forth. So thank you for that introduction. But on that particular webinar that is coming up, you are going to be a panel. Would you like to share some highlights around what may be covered from your standpoint or some of your colleagues in the panel?
Sure. At our upcoming webinar, we will be discussing, again, just kind of diving into each of these three categories of the E, S, and G, and talking about, first and foremost, sort of what are the key drivers of ESG? Why should banks care about ESG right now in this moment? And what are some of the best practices that banks can consider in either developing, exploring, or maintaining an ESG strategy? So first, kind of turning to what are the drivers of ESG, you touched on one, which is important, the regulatory driver. And we are kind of seeing that as a critical push right now. But right now, banks are exploring ESG because it's increasingly becoming a focus of interest for customers, employees, shareholders, and regulators. Part of this increased interest, I think, stems from the fact that social media and the ways in which we as a society currently communicate with one another and gather information has really increased the visibility of corporate activity. And so we're starting to see, with that sort of increased visibility of corporate activity, a shifting consumer sentiment, especially among younger demographics, where there's a heightened interest in corporate transparency. That kind of heightened interest in corporate transparency is also fueling, as you touched on, this regulatory interest in ESG principles. We're seeing ESG becoming a key focus, not just of regulators, but also of policymakers and lawmakers and the executive administration. So a few recent efforts are important to touch on, I think. President Biden has pledged that the United States will reduce greenhouse gas emissions with a goal of reaching net zero emission by 2050. And so while ESG encompasses a lot of different factors, it really seems as though right now the focus on E in particular is really kind of driving this discussion. The Biden administration has really been moving pretty quickly with efforts to explore E and the intersection of environmental factors with the financial services industry. Last year, President Biden signed an executive order on climate-related financial risk, which directed the members of the Financial Stability Oversight Council to evaluate climate-related risk. FSOC followed by publishing a report, and that was quickly followed by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency publishing a set of draft principles for climate-related financial risk for large institutions. So again, we're starting to see more efforts in this space as the federal banking agencies respond to the executive order and the directives of FSOC. And as was announced only yesterday, the SEC in a few weeks will publish a proposed climate reporting rule. So again, there's a lot of activity here on the horizon.
So Jayda, first, let me thank you personally that you seem to be passionate about this topic, clearly, based on what you have said. So thank you for that. Then again, thank you for, through ICBA, taking this topic to community banks who are whole and soul, if I can say, of the country. So they are going to indirectly take it to their customers. You spoke about customers, shareholders, and etc. So thank you for that. Then thank you for introducing this topic, also touching upon what OCC is doing, ACC is doing, the regulatory aspect of it. And perhaps there are a lot of more questions that are there. You touched upon risks, you touched upon the compliances, you touched upon marketing, consumer, etc. And so obviously there are questions in terms of who will drive ESG within the bank, who will drive it, what could be the new disclosures. So we will touch upon all these aspects in detail in the panel. So thank you for kind of touching on these points. We'll go into details. Thank you for participating in today's event. Thank you for sharing the feedback that you have received from ICBA Live that you attended last week. Any closing comments, thoughts that you have before we end today's HEXATalk session?
Absolutely. I think while there's certainly a lot of heightened regulatory interest right now on ESG, it's important to understand that there's currently not a uniform or required ESG reporting framework. And so because there isn't a uniform required ESG reporting framework, there are several emerging frameworks that are widely used, but there isn't consistency in the marketplace with ESG metrics. It's very difficult right now for institutions to evaluate ESG strategy, disclose an ESG plan without sort of firm benchmarks to compare a single institution against its peers or the industry at large. And so this lack of consistency creates some risks that banks do need to be critically attuned to. But it also creates an opportunity for banks to begin thinking about ESG, to start discussions within their institutions and take advantage of the flexibility that exists currently in exploring these metrics. So there's a lot to explore. I know that we'll be meeting again soon in a few weeks for our webinar, where we will surely explore both those risks and opportunities and best practices in more detail.
Excellent. Thank you, Jayda. This was a lovely discussion, and we look forward to talking to you in a few weeks again. Have a good one.
Thank you so much for having me.